Okay, so we're very glad to have Dr. Christopher Little here today. He is a physical oceanographer and a senior staff scientist at Atmospheric and Environmental Research. His research seeks to improve understanding of physical controls on the rate of sea level change, focusing on one, coupled ocean ice sheet interactions, and two, the relationship between basin scale sea level changes and those occurring at coastline. Chris received his PhD in geosciences from Princeton University and a bachelor's in chemistry from Williams College. So welcome, Chris.
I didn't hear that last thing, Patrick, but did you say I should get started?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Some reason it got garbled. I didn't want to miss my cue. Okay, well, I see some familiar faces in the audience, so thank you, the ones that I know for joining, as well as those that I don't know. I am glad that I finally get a chance to speak at the seminar series. I was telling Patrick I really appreciate it. I like the sort of multi-dimensional nature of sea level change that comes out in the talks, and I'm a longtime listener and first-time caller. So here we go. Thanks for listening to my talk. So I want to say before that that it's not just me talking today. A lot of collaborators and co-authors have contributed to the work. I'll try to mention them as I go through it, but I definitely want to call out Steve Yeager and John Crasting, who are co-Is on some of these projects, and a couple different NOAA task forces who are hopefully going to drive this work in a little bit more relevant direction, so that we can apply it to forecasting tools and societal needs. And it's been a real pleasure to work with some of these more hands-on pragmatic elements of sea level variability and sea level forecasting. I also wanted to thank funding from funders from NSF and NOAA. I'll mention them again later in the talk, but it's been critical to getting this work going, and I'm looking forward to many more things. Okay, so the roadmap today is going to highlight the importance of ocean model horizontal resolution, and the reason why we want to think about horizontal resolution in global models when we're thinking about sea level prediction and understanding the historical record. I'm then going to go into two case studies, kind of showing two very different aspects of how high resolution models influence coastal sea level variability. The first one is going to be focused on more of a global comparison, point-wise, at tide gauges. And then the second part of the talk, or part of the meat of the talk, is going to be on some early work looking at basin scale multi-decadal variability in the Pacific. So we're looking at sea level observations, but we're using CESM simulations in order to see how the models do, and then to try to understand some of the mechanisms. For the most part, those are going to be, I'm going to call them high resolution, or HR, and LR for low resolution. There's about a factor of 10 difference in the horizontal resolution. If you think of it aerially, it's about 100 times increase in ocean resolution in the high resolution models. And then I'm going to hopefully close with some thoughts, just preliminary thoughts on implications for sea level forecasting, and how to sort of judiciously use these high resolution simulations in a forecast capacity. But again, that stuff is preliminary, and I'm looking for feedback. Okay, so why do we need global models when we're thinking about coastal sea level variability? I've kind of divided it into two rough categories here. Sea level prediction, which we often think about sort of longer term sea level predictions, decadal to centennial, coming out of CMIP class models. But there's also a need for shorter term sea level forecasts, and an ability to make shorter term sea level forecasts. And just to highlight the sort of target here, if we look at tide gauges on the southeast coast of the US, kind of showing the region in the map there, The sea level anomalies that you get on interannual to decadal timescales can be quite large, so on the order of 5 to 10 centimeters. And the regional, it's sort of spatially widespread. So it's like you've got a kind of a target of opportunity that's relatively large in spatial scale and relatively large relative to, say, decades worth of global mean sea level change. So there's targets there kind of on both sides of that, spanning that whole range of timescales in terms of prediction, where we want to do that well. And then the other major sort of goal that we have in using global models to understand sea level is trying to interpret the tide gauge record, which is a really long, stable record that has some ability to reflect climate changes and oceanographic changes over long timescales where we don't necessarily have other observations that can help us. And in order to interpret those linkages between global, regional climate and tide gauges, we need large-scale models that represent coastal sea level. So the key point that I want to make here is that we need to have these global models that include teleconnections, remotely forced variability, and also be able to represent their regional or local scale impact in a climate model. That doesn't all have to be done within one simulation, but we have to understand those relationships. So then the next question is, why is high resolution important? And maybe this audience is already familiar enough with the importance of high resolution in coastal sea level, but I just want to highlight a couple key points. The first is that when you get to the coastlines, you have physical constraints such as coastline morphology, bathymetry, that can really influence the sea level field and the propagation of sea level signals from the open ocean. You also have forcing directly of coastal sea level variability that is superimposed on top of sea level variability at larger scales. So in order to represent those phenomena, you need to resolve the spatial scales of the processes, which can be quite small on and near coastlines. And then the second aspect of the importance of high resolution is that when you represent processes at high resolution in a global model, you resolve things like eddies and coupled interactions at smaller scales that have an influence on the large-scale sea level field. So you can influence both the small-scale processes and the small-scale phenomena occurring at the coast and also the large-scale through the sort of cumulative integrated impact of these small-scale processes. So just to highlight that quickly without going into too much detail, these are two projections from CESM coupled simulations projecting sea level change along the US East Coast and in the open ocean in a low resolution and a high resolution coupled model. The resolutions in the models are very similar to the ones I'll be talking about later today. And you can see that the trends, the 100-year trends, are quite different along the coast. And in particular, you get a much more uniform coastal expression of that sea level rise in the high resolution model. There are differences offshore as well. And if you look at the time series that sort of sits underneath these trends, there's really dramatic differences in the evolution of these sea level fields in a high resolution model and in the low resolution model. So that may be even more important from a sort of coastal impacts perspective than these long-term trends. So it sort of emphasizes the fact that even over long time scales, these small-scale processes are important in determining what these models predict. Okay, so I want to seize this opportunity. We have a lot of long high-resolution simulations emerging from many modeling groups, not just CESM. We have intercomparisons of low and high resolution simulations in sort of OMIP style experiments, which are happening where we can get this direct information about what high resolution represents, what it does versus low resolution. And so that's allowing us to resolve these short spatial scale and long time scale phenomena, which include what I was showing before, both effects on the large scale and these local sea level gradients. But because of the fact that there's always a cost associated with these high resolution models in terms of computation and a cost in terms of limiting the amount of the sort of uncertainty space that you can capture, I think it's really important to try to understand a little bit better what we're getting when we do these high resolution simulations. Where are the improvements occurring? Both in terms of really understanding those mechanisms, but also in terms of if we're going to incorporate these into forecast models or incorporate the lessons learned into course resolution models, we have this sort of mechanistic and background of what's going on. Okay, so that is the importance of, I think, doing these types of experiments to understand or analyzing these experiments in order to understand what we get from high resolution. So as I promised, I have two case studies comparing the tide gauge record in these high and low resolution CESM simulations. The first one is a global comparison looking at a pointwise comparison with tide gauges. So it's in review with the title below. It's focusing on annual to multi-decadal timescales and differences in the representation of coastal sea level. The paper has been in review for what seems like annual to multi-decadal timescales. So I hope that it's going to come out soon. I'm happy to distribute it to anybody who's interested in it. But I'll talk a little bit about it in the slides that follow. Okay, so we're comparing two different ocean model simulations in a forced ocean sea ice configuration. So that means that we're using a reanalysis at the surface, winds, heat fluxes, to drive the ocean model. And the only differences that we're getting in terms of the representation of coastal sea level are coming from the ocean model resolution. And any parameterizations that are different in the ocean associated with that. So these are done under a protocol called the OMIP protocol, where you repeatedly force a simulation with a reanalysis from 1958 to 2018 in the OMIP2 simulations. And you do that in these simulations 5 times. So we have multiple forcing cycles, identical forcing, and we're looking at the differences or the ocean response to that forcing. So right now in this presentation, I'm going to show cycles 2 to 4. And the reason why I'm dwelling on this will become apparent when we look at the next slides. So we look at over 300 tide gauges. I'm only going to show a couple today, and I'm going to look at regionally aggregated results. When the paper comes out or when you get a chance to look at it, you can see the results at more, the comparisons at more detail. We look at the 1993 to 2018 period, looking at low-pass filtered, so 13-month low-pass filtered. This is annual to decadal timescale differences that we're looking at. And we've corrected for a couple terms that come into the tide gauges. I'm happy to talk more about those corrections later if necessary. I'm also happy to talk about other timescales or frequency bands and other timescales or periods of time. We decided for a variety of reasons to look at the more recent record that overlaps with the altimetry record. So just to highlight the general approach, we've got these 2 models, which are global models. You can see that the just a simple measure of SSH variability, the variance, you can get some quite different characteristics and higher amplitude variability in the HR versus the LR if you look at the maps. Also on the maps are the tide gauge locations that we're comparing to, just along the US East Coast, but we do this globally. And the locations of the grid points where we're comparing the model output to the tide gauges. So you can see those in white stars, and obviously they're much closer in the high resolution model than they are in the low resolution model. So if we look in particular at the Charleston tide gauge, which is circled here, you can see the time series that come out from the tide gauges and the model grid points at this location. So in all the plots, I'm going to show that all the plots that follow, I'm going to show tide gauges in black, low resolution model in blue, high resolution model in orange. So in the case of Charleston, you can see that both models sort of roughly follow the time series in terms of their correlation, but that the high resolution model has a much larger amplitude variability in the coastal sea level as you get to Charleston. But one thing that immediately jumps out is that we have very different evolutions of that time series depending on the forcing cycle. And what that's coming from is that's coming from intrinsic variability, internal variability in the ocean, even under a fixed the identical forcing of the atmosphere. So that's what I'm going to be calling intrinsic variability. You've got eddies that are causing sea level variability that's independent or quasi-independent of the forcing that's applied. Okay, so that's a general background to this, the analysis that's done in this paper. We look just in terms of very simple aggregate metrics, because we're doing this global analysis of agreement between the models and improvement in the high resolution models relative to low resolution. So there are way too many dots and information on these plots to really get into in the course of this talk. So I'm going to try to simplify the results a little bit. Again, the top panel is looking at the normalized increase in variance. So how much more variance do you get in the high resolution versus the low resolution model relative to tide gauges, where red is, it's not 0.5%, we're talking about 50%. Sorry about that labeling there. So 0.5 is like a 50%. The red scale goes up to almost 100% larger variance, and even beyond that in certain regions. And the bottom, we can see that the difference in the correlation between the model and the tide gauges between the high resolution and the low resolution. So red indicates that you have a higher correlation between the tide gauges and the high resolution model than you do the low resolution model. Blue indicates the opposite. So the first thing that you can see is that the differences in the statistics and the agreement of the models with observations kind of clusters into these regions, where, for instance, if you look at the Baltic Sea, where we have a lot of tide gauges, you can see that you get a dramatic increase in the variance and correlation in the high resolution model. You can also see that sort of in the attached Gulf Stream region of the US East Coast that I was pointing out before. You have a big increase in variance and correlation. So much significant improvement in those regions. So again, getting back to that point, if you look at attached western boundary currents, so the Kuroshio, Japan, the US Southeast Coast, the Gulf Coast, where you have these attached western boundary currents, you can see that variability being much better represented in the high resolution model in terms of its amplitude than in the low resolution model. If you look at the correlation, you can see that in general, there are very few places, well, in general, the correlation is improved when you look at these different regions, some places more than others. Some places, the correlation doesn't change very much. It looks like most of the response, at least in terms of the phasing of the variability, is captured by the low resolution model. But you can actually see kind of stark contrast between what I pointed out before, between the Kuroshio and between the southeast US coast, where you have these attached western boundary currents. In the Kuroshio, you actually have a decrease in correlation with tide gauges using the high resolution simulations. In the attached Gulf Stream, it's the opposite. And the reason why, to kind of jump to the conclusion, is that that's coming from the fact that intrinsic variability plays a larger role in coastal sea level variability in the Kuroshio. So that actually decreases the correlation of the forced model with the tide gauges. So one thing that that regional similarity allows us to do is kind of isolate the general model data differences and tide gauge to model differences by using sort of representative tide gauges. So in this slide, I'm showing three different tide gauges. One Helsinki, one Tan-Noa, which is in the Kuroshio, attached Kuroshio region, so really high intrinsic variability, and then San Francisco, which is kind of indicative of the North American West Coast. So if you look at Helsinki, you can see that there is a fairly high correlation in the low resolution and high resolution model, but there is a much better representation of the amplitude of variability. It's almost spot on in this very narrow, shallow sea that we're getting this representation of the historical sea level variability much better, and I would say very well in the high resolution model. If you look at the Kuroshio example, you can see that we get a lot better match to the variability in the tide gauge record in terms of its amplitude, but that because of that intrinsic variability, the agreement actually it varies widely between the cycles. If you look at San Francisco, you don't see that intrinsic variability. We could call this kind of a forced regime, an atmospherically forced regime. But there's really not much difference between the low resolution and the high resolution, somewhat surprisingly, and they're both damped relative to observations. So we kind of cover the gamut in terms of the different regimes and the way in which high resolution influences the representation of sea level. Okay, so I know I'm moving quickly, but that's just a kind of highlight of that paper. So we have these general dynamic regimes, and the models improvements kind of cluster in these regions. We generally see an improvement in the representation of coastal sea level variability at high resolution, but sometimes it can degrade if you're using specific metrics like correlation. Many regions do not show substantial improvements, so that increased computational burden, greatly increased 100-time computational burden is something worth thinking about if we're trying to depending on what our applications are. And then this idea that there's intrinsic variability and substantial intrinsic variability poses challenges for doing a good model evaluation. Are we getting it right for the right reasons? And it has some implications that are currently unclear in my mind for predictability and forecasting. So given those findings, and in particular the last one with the intrinsic variability, I've started working on a new project that spends a little bit more time trying to understand in more detail the relative roles of forced and intrinsic variability in coastal sea level, specifically around the US. And the project is a little bit of a blend between research focused, sort of physically motivated questions, and then also trying to turn that into some sort of insights in terms of how NOAA should think about relatively short, I don't know if that's short term, so monthly to annual lead time sea level forecasting. So the research questions that we're asking are, again, can we do a better job of partitioning the atmospherically forced and intrinsic components, because those are going to have much different potentially different implications for prediction systems and predictability. Try to understand whether our model improvements are coming from one or the other, and then think about the timescales and the spatial structure of intrinsic variability, with the idea that we can start to think about, with this information, how are we going to deal with these different processes? Are we going to statistically parameterize them? Are we going to think about using high resolution in some limited form or limited areas? What model resolution do we need in order to capture enough of that signal as it affects coastal sea level? And then more broadly, just how to allocate computational resources. Okay, so this is just a quick teaser of those results. What I'm doing here is comparing tide gauge and altimetry variance in observations in the leftmost panel, in the high resolution model in the middle panel. And what you can see is that there's really good agreement in the monthly detrended, deseasonalized time series from the observations that we have in the high resolution model. Including things like the band along the southeast coast of enhanced variance. And then using multiple simulations or multiple cycles and repeat year forcing, where we don't have any external variability in the forcing fields, we can start to get at partitioning what the intrinsic fraction is. And if you look at it, you can see almost entirely eddy intrinsic variability in the Gulf Stream after it detaches, very low variability due to eddies and intrinsic variability on the northeast US coast, and then somewhere in between when you get to the southeast US coast, where both of these play a role in determining coastal sea level variability in the Gulf and southeast coasts. So I think these are promising in terms of really figuring out what are the different factors, what are the different timescales that are involved here, although it's still preliminary. How am I doing on time, Patrick? I feel like it's going longer than I expected, but like, what would be good guidance to shoot for? 10
Uh,
minutes, 15 minutes?
I think we have about 20 minutes left.
20 minutes left, and that includes discussion?
No, after that, 10 more minutes for discussion.
Okay. Okay, that's like plenty of time. Maybe I've rushed it. Okay, so I did promise a second element, which was going to address a kind of completely different aspect of how high resolution might influence the representation of coastal sea level. And that's focusing on a problem of basin scale multi-decadal variability in the Pacific. And this work is a little bit earlier stage, got inspired by some time that I spent in Boulder last summer, where I was working with people who are very interested in the sort of problem of long-term trends in the Pacific. So feedback is welcome. It's still cooking. All right, so this is going to give short shrift to this problem, which hopefully some people have some context for. But observations have shown that there's this apparent zonal dipole in various climate-related quantities in the Pacific Ocean, where you have almost this IPO-like cold pattern in the Eastern Pacific, and a cold Eastern Pacific or a warm Western Pacific in terms of the trends in warming. So that jumps out of this top panel here, where we've got sort of a very zonally heterogeneous pattern of warming with a well-defined spatial structure. A lot of people have chalked that up to the Walker circulation strengthening over the last 30 or 40 years, which makes sense, although there are other questions relating to how that's happening, whether it's forced, whether it's internal variability, that are still being debated. There's also an element that's kind of emerging recently, where people have proposed a strong teleconnection to the Southern Ocean, which you can actually see in this SST plot, a band of cooling SSTs that is potentially connected to what's going on in the Pacific as a whole. So the other aspect of this issue is that this trend towards this zonal dipole is not evident in CMIP class models, and it's not consistent with either forced or internal variability in the models. So it seems like there's something that's going wrong, or that the models are not capturing in terms of this trend that we've seen in the observations and the reanalyses. The other element that's kind of come out recently from some of Steve Yeager's work is that high resolution initialized simulations seem to represent this trend better than the low resolution model. So that sort of sets the stage for the second part of this talk, which we're going to go to, which really revolves around these two questions. The first is, can we use the tide gauge record to extend what we have from basin scale sea level, which is really just from the altimeter record starting in 1993. And then we're going to try to ask whether the representation is improved in that large-scale trend in high-resolution models. Okay, so I'm going to go very quickly through the tide gauges that I used and the processing. I'm happy to come back to it. So I'm looking at a time period in the tide gauges in the Pacific Basin from 1950 on. There's about 33 tide gauges that are relatively complete and that give you some perspective on sea level on the eastern and western boundaries and in the Central Pacific, and to a limited extent, South America. So what I'm doing with those is I'm taking an annual mean, I'm removing the global mean sea level change from them, and I'm also removing a linear trend from the tide gauges, which takes out, hopefully, most of the land motion signal, and would also remove any other signal, any other long-term linear trend. But it doesn't remove multi-decadal variability. So we can still analyze variability, we've just removed a long-term trend from the tide gauges in order to make sure that land motion doesn't contaminate it. We then do an IB correction. So there's more detail in there I'm happy to talk about. But if you look at the annual mean tide gauges, you can see that there's substantial annual variability. But then if you smooth that to look at the lower frequencies, you end up with some evidence that you reach a peak in the Eastern Pacific in these tide gauges around 1980 or 1990. And the other side of the Pacific, and in some parts of the sort of Western equatorial Pacific, you have the opposite side. So it looks like there's some sort of dipole going on at multi-decadal variability in the tide gauge record. So it's cleaner to, rather than look at the individual tide gauges, to take an EOF to examine the spatial structure at the basin scale. So what I've done is taken an EOF of the basin scale tide gauge, all the tide gauges, and then we can compare that to what we get out of altimetry over the 1993 to 21 period. And the message that I'm trying to get in this across in this slide is that what's happening in the tide gauges very closely matches with what's happening in the altimeter record in terms of the zonal dipole, both in an interannual sense, but also in a long-term trend sense over the length of the altimeter record. So the time series associated with EOF loadings, the PCs, are shown on the right side, and you can see that the tide gauges and altimetry in orange and blue lie pretty much on top of each other, have both interannual variability and a trend over the altimeter record. But if you go back further in time, you can see that that EOF from the tide gauges actually reverses itself. So it looks like this trend towards a sort of reverses itself in the earlier 20 to 30 year period. The other line on there, the solid line, is not an EOF, it's a low frequency component analysis, which makes it even clearer that it looks like what's happening here is really a multi-decadal trend. Okay, so that's kind of the first part of this talk. What I'd like to do is be able to connect this tide gauge derived record of the basin scale variability to longer model simulations. But for now, what I've done is focus on the altimeter record and just this declining trend. And what I'm going to do next is compare the declining trend that we see in the altimeter record to high and low resolution decadal prediction experiments. I know it's jumping around a little bit, but hopefully you're staying with me. So we're using the set of CESM decadal prediction experiments. They're initialized from a forced ocean sea ice run, and then you run an ensemble of coupled runs from various starting points, starting in the 1970s, and going through 2016 or so, I think might be the last one. And so those are run both at high resolution and at low resolution, again, using the same ocean model, coupled to atmosphere and sea ice models for the prediction part of the experiments. So what I'm going to be doing in the next slide is showing the differences between altimetry records, high resolution records, and high resolution decadal prediction experiments and low resolution decadal prediction experiments over the altimeter record. So I'm going to be looking at trends from around 1993 to 2019 and comparing those with observations. So the main results are here. If you look at altimetry, we can see that we've got evidence for this zonal dipole. So falling sea level in the Eastern Pacific, rising in the Western. We've also got extratropical variability, and in particular, a strong sea level fall in the Southern Ocean, the Pacific Southern Ocean. If you look over to the high resolution experiments and look at the trends, they're very close. They show that sort of dipole. They show that large sea level fall in the Southern Ocean. But if you look at the coarse resolution 1 degree simulations, you end up with a very different trend over this 20-25 year period of time, where you have actually a trend of the opposite sign in the Eastern Pacific, and a much different sort of spatial structure of the sea level fall in the Southern Ocean, where it's zonally uniform as opposed to happening in this patch. The panels below just show whether, in fact, those linear trends are consistent or inconsistent with each other. We're looking at lower values, meaning that the trends are consistent, and you can see in the high resolution decadal prediction simulations that the trends are far more consistent with observations when you think about errors arising from different sources. Okay, so this second element or second case study is really focused again at basin scale variability in the Pacific, showing a couple different things. First of all, that coastal sea level seems to record that large scale trend in altimeter era sea level dipole. It also suggests that there might have been a trend the opposite direction if you go back further in time. We show that the trends in the altimeter record seem to be better represented in high resolution simulations, especially in the tropical Pacific, Southeast Pacific, and Southern Ocean. And it makes the point that, it's not always just resolving those coastal processes that is important with the high resolution model. It's the integrated, aggregated impact of those small scale processes on the large scale field that can make a difference. Okay, so I think I have maybe a couple more minutes to go through what I promised, which was some speculations on how we might use this information to think about more applied goals like sea level forecasting over different time horizons. Okay, so one general finding that's coming out of the work that I've been doing and others have been doing is that resolution-related improvements depend upon the timescale and region considered. And although I didn't really show it in today's talk, it's probably going to be model dependent to some extent. So in order to help us clarify that dependence on different models and the different types of things that high resolution does better or the same as low resolution models, I think it would be really helpful to have a suite of diagnostics, addressing different timescales and addressing the along coast spatial scale, but also the across coast scales. How are those sea level signals connected between the open ocean and the coast, and do models do that well? So the other element that I think is just kind of a background theme is that these forecasting systems have different goals and often are resource constrained by the types of simulations that they can use. And I think a way to move forward on that is to develop a suite of forecasting strategies that incorporate some of the lessons learned from high resolution comparisons in unique and smart ways. And I definitely don't have all of those prepared. I don't, but I do have a couple of case studies, excuse me, where I can start to think about how you might, put those abstract ideas into a more concrete framework. Obviously, the more evaluation of these models that we've done using diagnostics that are relevant will allow us to help develop those strategies better. Okay, so I want to close with a couple of particular examples of what I mean by sort of developing forecast strategies based on the results of these simulations. So if we look at the results from San Francisco, again, like I mentioned, we have very similar time series of sea level from low resolution and high resolution models, which seems to say that the low resolution is doing pretty well at translating that climate forcing or surface forcing to coastal sea level. It's just damped. So, one forecasting strategy might be, use a low resolution model, but inflate the variance so that you can actually capture the amplitude. That's kind of a dumb way to do it. I'm sure there's more sophisticated ways out there, but happy to discuss those. So then if you get to the Southeast US, that's probably not a way that we can go about this. We've got, a lot of intrinsic variability that's that we, first of all, we don't really understand exactly what that's contributing, and second, it changes the nature of that correlation. So I think that, you know, the results of the current project that I'm working on will help us better understand that noise and its origin, you know, whether it's truly noise or whether there's some way to predict that intrinsic variability. And, you know, if we do it right, we might be able to figure out a way to use those results offline in order to provide additional information or additional representation of that variability in a coarse resolution model. In terms of the last topic, I don't have any simple answers. The models, you know, the high resolution model does give you qualitatively different outcomes for certain sea level trends. Those are going to be difficult to parameterize, but I think we have to continue to focus on trying to understand the mechanisms that drive those, you know, large scale emergent trends, in order to figure out, you know, what is it that these high resolution models are doing that are not represented in the low resolution models. And of course, we should consider, you know, the forced or internal nature of those trends, and think about that in terms of the you know, ability of our current generation models to predict you know, force trends into the future, and low frequency internal variability for that matter. Okay, so that's the conclusions. I do want to thank, since this was sort of an integrative presentation, a bunch of different projects that I've got going on with NOAA and NSF, series for sponsoring that fellowship, where I learned a little bit about the tropical Pacific, and then suppliers of model output and data, which are critical to these analyses. And that's it. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Chris. Do we have any questions? Yes, Reza.
Hi, Chris. Very nice presentation. Thank you. I'm Reza Marsuli from Stevens Institute of Technology. I have a comment and a question. A comment about the differences in the accuracy of the high and low resolution models. So there are not much differences when we look at like San Francisco based on the last slide, but larger differences in areas like southeast of the US. I was wondering if the differences can be because of the width of the continental shelf, because we know that the water level piles up on shallow waters. So, and the model is not simulating tides, right? It's only the residual water levels or storm surge. And so we know a storm surge piles up in shallow waters, and specifically along the East Coast, the storm surges are larger than along the West Coast. So I was wondering, maybe because the continental shelf is very narrow along the West Coast, so it really doesn't matter if we use a 0.1 degree or a 1 degree resolution, because eventually we cannot resolve very well the continental shelf and the process which results in increasing in the water level. So that was one comment. Maybe that can be one reason. My question is about the accuracy of the model and what causes one model to be more accurate than the other. So I was wondering if the improvement in the accuracy of the high resolution model is due to the better ability of the high resolution ocean model to resolve the coastal processes or the oceanic processes, or it can be also due to a better resolution of atmospheric forcing. In other words, I was wondering if the models are forced at each grid point of the ocean model, or both high resolution and low resolution models are using the same grid resolution for the atmospheric forcing. So the atmospheric forcing is not something which can improve the results.
Yeah, there were a lot of interesting questions in your first point. Yeah, for first section, I think topography and representing coastal bathymetry or coastal processes is important. But to jump to your question, it depends. So I actually touched on two different types of simulations here. The first one where I was looking more at the tide gauge to model point-wise comparison, we're forced with the same atmosphere. The only difference there, and it's just an ocean model, the only difference there is that it is downscaled to the grid resolution of the ocean model. So the fields are the same, they have the same time variability, it's just that their spatial resolution is enhanced. It's not a different forcing field that's actually applied to the ocean. So in that case, I think I feel comfortable saying that the differences in that first set of simulations are arising from ocean processes, which could be any number of different factors and probably depends on what region you're paying attention to. On the second one, where I was looking at the large scale trends, those are coupled simulations, and the model atmosphere is increased in resolution at the same time as the ocean model. So that mechanistic, it's complicated. I know that Steve Yeager was working on it, understanding the mechanisms as they apply to surface temperature and surface pressure variability, but it's a complicated pathway that I think we're going to have to spend some time really understanding whether the ocean or atmosphere is the primary contributor and the role of the coupled interaction in getting it right. Because it seems like it's not just the force simulations doing better, it's really the coupled interaction that's getting those, that's making those trends look better in the Pacific and Southern Ocean.
Good point. Yeah, thanks. Great work. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, Nathaniel.
Hey, yeah, Nathaniel. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Christopher, for your wonderful presentation. I just wanted to also know whether the input data actually used were all in the same temporal resolution, like say on a time scale of say hourly, monthly, or that, because I know some of them can actually be generated like that, but why some due to some data can actually be obtained as sparse data or something. We're all the data in the same temporal resolution, or some of them were obtained in different resolution from the other. To know if something like that could also affect the results you obtain for both the lower resolution and high resolution.
Are you
also,
talking about, oh, sorry.
Okay. Yes. So I also wanted to know if you're considering you're considering other parameters, maybe to just check to see if you get similar result as the sea level result obtained.
So I think the first part was about temporal coverage in an observational data or in model output. I just want to make sure that.
Yeah, I mean the input data, like the one you use as your boundary conditions and something like that. Yeah, for the forcing data you use.
Yeah, the forcing data for these models is imposed from a reanalysis. So I can't remember off the top of my head how often it's imposed, but it should be the same in both models. And we'd have to go back and look at the sort of OMIP forcing protocol to get it right, but it's on the order of hours. Okay. I don't know if anybody on the call knows the OMIP forcing well enough to answer that. And then I forgot the second part already. Yeah,
the second one is apart from sea level rise, are there some other parameters that maybe in the future you are considering, like also trying to see how much the low resolution and high resolution models will affect their simulations?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just me. There's a lot of people who are working on these simulations, and I think they're publicly available. So I would encourage others to look at their variables of interest, and I think that's I am interested in it, with the sea level mindset, and how these variables might drive sea level or be connected to them in some way. So I guess that's the best answer I can give.
All right, thank you so much. Because why I asked is because I don't know how much some atmospheric variables can affect sea level rise. I'm just also checking some other aspects of coastal parameters that may also be affected by the atmospheric data. And in that case, one can actually infer that maybe a social location, just like what you observed in the southeast, that something like this exists in sea level rise. However, some other variables are changing the other way around, something like that, has been observed in either the low resolution models and the high resolution models. Yeah.
Lots
So
of work
that's
to do.
nice. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. We have a question from Gavin in the chat. He says the high resolution models show a clear improvement in the forced ocean sea ice simulation, but that is with a fixed atmosphere forcing. In real predictions, there is a lot more chaos in the forcing and presumably in the ocean eddy field. And so one might expect that you'll need a much larger ensemble to beat down the weather noise. I'd be interested to know how different those ensemble mean trends would be in the low resolution or high resolution runs. Yeah.
The ensemble mean trends would be in the high resolution and low resolution model runs. Or so maybe I shouldn't have presented two different case studies, because now I'm getting confused as to which one this is. At first I thought it was the first, and now I'm thinking it's the second. Because in the second case, we did have it is an ensemble of coupled simulations that were being run. Gavin, does that get at your question, or have I misinterpreted it?
I'm not. You might not.
Not available. I think that's a good point, that the relative level of intrinsic variability or eddy variability will change when you have a coupled atmosphere. But I don't know which direction it's going to go. I'd have to spend some time thinking about that and learning what other people have done. All I can comment on is that in the decadal prediction experiments, there is a coupled atmosphere at a high resolution as well.
And Gavin added another comment. But what is the difference in that pattern rather than the variant?
Difference in the pattern versus the variance. In the trend versus the variance?
Yes, I think you meant the trend.
So for this, that's a I mean, I want to make sure that I'm answering the right question. If this is in fact what we're talking about, because I do have something that has some indication of the level of variance and the significance of these trends. But maybe I should follow up offline.
I think he was referring to the ensemble mean. Yeah. Yeah, he said that's useful. Thanks.
Welcome to come back to me with anything offline.
Hey, Patrick, it's Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy.
Hey, Chris. Question from the first part. If you can toggle back, you showed an image of the correlation improvement or change. Yeah. I'm sorry if I missed it, but do you talk about the cluster of blue dots on the south part of Norway?
Blue dots on the south part of Norway, yes. In the paper. So it's blue in that it looks like HR is getting lower variance. So weaker variability in the HR than the LR. And it's actually that there's a dipole there, right? It's higher in the Baltic Sea and it's lower outside of it. My speculation is that the LR basically blocks any waves or variability at the Baltic Sea. And so you're getting artificially high variability outside the enclosed sea.
I got it.
And you can see that in the comparison with the tide gauges. The tide gauges are much more compatible with the HR. So this metric doesn't necessarily mean better or worse. It just means increased. For the most part, an increase is a good thing, but not there. Good
Okay.
eye. It's a good eye.
No, thanks.
I'd forgotten about that.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Nice to see you.
Yeah, same.
Okay, any other questions? Gavin also had a comment that we have some work on the Southern Ocean trend related to freshwater addition, which also seems to be important.
I saw his Boulder presentation a couple weeks ago, and so that's definitely on my mind. I think I tried to say that the Southern Ocean teleconnections and the origin of them is interesting area of work, and sea ice is tied into that as well. So I think that's interesting. But maybe sea level can say something about it that's unique, and maybe we can go back a little further if you trust what what I'm doing with the tide gauges.
Okay, well, we're about at the hour, so I guess we could stop there. Unless there are any other questions? Okay, well, thanks again, Chris.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and I'm happy for more feedback. If you got any thoughts, Phil and others.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
Enjoyed it.